Good evening, St. Mary's. As you can tell by the smudge on my forehead, we've just completed our Ash Wednesday service. This is our footstep into our season of Lent, leading us to Holy Week and then to the glory of Easter. But February is also Black History Month, and that's what I'm here to speak to you tonight. The person I'm going to talk to you about tonight, the Right Reverend Barbara Harris, is probably not a name that resonates with a lot of you. At least not like it might if I had said, say, Martin Luther King or Barack Obama or Harriet Tubman or Rosa Parks. But without a doubt, Bishop Harris was a remarkable woman in her own right. She was a champion for women, people of color, the LGBTQ community, the poor, and anyone who just needed love. And Bishop Harris also happened to be one badass bishop. Barbara Harris was born on June 12, 1930 in Pennsylvania, growing up in Germantown, and she attended St. Barnabas Church there. Bishop Harris was confirmed in the Episcopal Church in 1941, and she recounted how the aging white bishop wore gloves when he visited black congregations so that he did not ever have to touch an African American who were part of that congregation. And this was especially true if it was an all African American congregation, which Barbara shared that he didn't visit very often. Barbara came from a long line of very strong women, including her great-grandmother, who had been a slave on a plantation in Maryland. They called her Mom Sem. Barbara spoke fondly of hearing stories from her great-grandmother, including an encounter that Mom Sem had with General Grant. Yes, that General Grant, Ulysses Grant, during the time of the Civil War. General Grant asked a 12-year-old Mom Sem for a ladle of water, which she gratefully and graciously provided to him. As soon as she handed it to him, he tossed that water aside. And Mom Sem said to him, "You didn't have to do that. That water was clean." And General Grant responded, "Just fetch me another one. If you knew how many times people like you tried to poison people like me, you'd understand. And all we're doing is here fighting for you." Well, Mom Sem, and remember, 12-year-old African-American little girl, looked at General Grant, and she said, "I don't need you to fight for me. I can fight for myself." So you can see where Bishop Harris's stock comes from. Barbara's mom was also very influential in her life, and I will speak more about that a little later. So Barbara grew up in the Episcopal Church, but many times she questioned if there was really a place for her in this church, as she faced racism, sexism, and just about every other ism that an African American female may face. Fortunately, the rector of her church was someone she trusted and felt protected by, and so she remained. As a young girl, Barbara experienced that only boys could serve at the altar. She couldn't even be an acolyte. Her jobs were in children's chapel and ministry and things of support nature, but never during the principal service. Though Barbara remained with the church, as an adult she experienced further oppression. The constitution of her church prevented women from serving on the vestry, and this caused a lot of resentment on Barbara's part. Barbara recounted at one annual parish meeting when the church was looking for new vestry members, rather than allowing some very qualified women to serve, they instead turned to a man who hadn't been at the congregation for many years. This led to Barbara to begin to protest and seek the legal means to change the church charter and constitutions that allowed women to serve on the vestry. There is so much more about Barbara's life in the church that is interesting, but I want to skip forward to her ordination to the diaconate. Now, Barbara worked in the public relations field and was quite successful at it. Barbara offered a unique perspective to some large corporations like U.S. Steel, Procter & Gamble, DuPont, and others. The perspective she brought was counseling these companies on their approach to reaching the Black community. Her job had her travel all over the country, east and west, north and south. And she was always conscious of where she was and what trouble may be around the corner because she was a woman of color. Barbara was in Washington, D.C. in 1963 during the March on Washington and heard with her own ears the speech delivered by Martin Luther King known as "I Have a Dream." In 1965, Barbara found herself in Selma, Alabama, to take part in the march to Montgomery. As an African-American woman, she was subject to vile obscenities and threats of violence. As she and her friends began their departure from Montgomery to return home, the plane that was to take them was not allowed to taxi to the gate or refuel. So the group she was in had to hike with flashlights to where the plane was parked, and they were able to take off, and they had to land immediately in Atlanta to refuel the plane, and then they were able to travel home. Undeterred, Barbara continued her civil rights activism by working the summer in the Delta of Mississippi, helping with voter registration and education. In 1968, Barbara was having dinner at a country club in Charlotte, North Carolina. And Barbara had just been formed and was digesting the fact that she was the first African American to dine in this country club. And at the same time, she was hearing the news of the assassination of Martin Luther King. It was irony that Barbara wasn't fond of. In 1974, Barbara lent her voice and service to the Episcopal bishops who defied the church's ban on ordaining women, as Barbara served as a thurifer at the ordination of the Philadelphia 11, the first women ordained as priests in the Episcopal Church. Barbara continued to become more active, serving on the Diocesan Council, Episcopal Community Services, and many other committees. In 1979, Barbara was elected to be a deputy to General Convention. This led to her becoming ordained as a deacon in that same year, and at the age of 49. Later, in 1980, Barbara was ordained to the priesthood. From 1980 to 1984, Barbara was priest in charge at St. Augustine of Hippo in Norristown, Pennsylvania. She also served as chaplain at Philadelphia County Prisons and as counsel to industrial corporations for public policy issues and social concerns. While executive director of the Episcopal Church Publishing Company from 1984 to 1988, Barbara wrote a monthly column for the progressive Episcopal magazine, The Witness. Her powerful work as a writer elevated her stature in the worldwide Anglican Communion. In 1988, a group reached out to Barbara to ask if they could nominate her for suffragan bishop in Massachusetts. After speaking to a couple of her closest confidants, Barbara thought, why not? The worst thing that could happen is she would get elected. And she thought that even getting nominated was about as remote a possibility as could be. And so she consented. Well, lo and behold, Barbara was nominated. She participated in what are now called walkabouts, where bishop candidates visit different parishes in the diocese to be interviewed by those who will be voting. The time came for the election of the bishop. First ballot, no clear winner, and Barbara was still on it. Second ballot, no clear winner, and Barbara was still on it. Third, fourth, fifth. And then finally, on the sixth ballot, on September 25th, 1988, Barbara was indeed elected as suffragan bishop, a first in the entire Anglican Communion. On February 11th, 1989, before 8,000 people and over 60 bishops, Barbara was consecrated as bishop. Now, I briefly mentioned Barbara's mother earlier. And during an ordination or a consecration, much like a wedding, there is a place where the presiding bishop asks those in attendance if anyone has a reason why the consecration should not take place. Now, Barbara was prepared for a lot of ill words directed her way. There was a schism brewing in the church over the ordination of women, but a female bishop, an African American at that, well, this would be the straw that would break the camel's back. So Barbara was worried what would be said about her, not for herself, but what her mom would hear. She was also aware of the threat of violence. The Boston Police Department offered her the use of a bulletproof vest, but Barbara refused, thinking if she was going to go, what better place to go than at God's altar with 8,000 of your closest friends? Barbara didn't fear being shot. What she feared was what her mom would hear being said about her daughter. But Barbara's mom was part of that good stock, and she was of great courage. And during the protest testimony, her mom walked over to where Barbara was sitting. She took her by the wrist, looked right into Barbara's face, and said, "Have no fear. God is on our side. Everything is going to be all right. This is your mama." And then turned and returned to her seat. Like I said, good stock. After all the protests had been heard, the presiding bishop stated that all positions of authority had consented to this action, and as such, under these circumstances, the consecration will proceed. The ovation was thunderous, and the Right Reverend Barbara Harris was consecrated as the first female bishop in the worldwide Anglican Communion. The Right Reverend Barbara Harris went on to have a very successful episcopate. She became a strong advocate for women, people of color, the LGBT community, and the poor. This advocacy brought heavy criticism. She was exposed to racism and sexism and was labeled a radical. This didn't deter Barbara, and in fact, Bishop Harris was a key speaker at the 2009 General Convention held in Anaheim, California, where the delegates had just voted overwhelmingly to support ordaining gay bishops and developing liturgies for same-sex unions. Barbara preached a sermon in which she said, "I do not understand how you can baptize people and then tell them that they're not fully welcome in the church. There is nothing that we call half-assed baptized in this church." Strong words from a very courageous woman. It was a huge moment for the LGBT community. They were finally recognized as full members of the church and as God's children. And it's one that is still celebrated today. Barbara retired as bishop in 2002 and continued in various roles helping shape the church as an inclusive body. In March of 2020, the Right Reverend Barbara Harris passed away at the age of 89. Often when Bishop Harris faced a challenge or a setback, when things might get ugly, she always responded with, "Alleluia anyhow." She would sometimes close sermons with this phrase. And her memoir, which I just read from Church Publishing, is titled, "Alleluia Anyhow." And I would recommend you read the stories about this remarkable woman and badass bishop. Good night.